Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. So I'm off today. It's Veterans Day. Just met up with a friend. We borrowed that at 50 to 140, and we were talking about the dilemma that sits in front of me, which is these two cameras right here. This is the Fujifilm X100VI, and this is the Fujifilm X-E5. And the debate that I've been having for over the last month is, are these two cameras complementary or are these two cameras redundant? And that's what I want to talk about today. All right, so these two cameras I have in front of me are very much similar, and in some ways they're very different. And the question is whether or not these cameras are redundant or are they complementary cameras to each other. So I want to start off by going through the things that make them redundant, because the dilemma that I'm fighting is, do I really need both of these? Or should I sell one of these and use the money to fund something more sports and professional oriented that I can use for shooting my kids' sports, or when I get asked to do like a wedding or a portrait session? Although these are both very capable of doing such things, do I need both these cameras? So let's start with what makes them very, very similar. First of all, let's look at the size and the aesthetic of these cameras. Now this has a grip on it, so you have to be a little bit careful of that. See if the camera can get me right here. Okay. But if you look at the overall size, kind of their design, the look and feel, they are very, very, very similar. They take the same exact battery. They both have the 40 megapixel sensor. They both have IBIS. They both have the same processors. They both have the same autofocus algorithms. And they all have the same film simulations. And so in many ways, these cameras are the exact same camera. And so from that perspective, I was wondering, why do I need both? But there's a couple things that make this camera, I guess, conundrum, decision, very unique. And so let's talk about some things that make them different, and maybe what gives the X100VI an advantage and what gives the X-E5 an advantage. Let's start with the X100VI. The X100VI, as I mentioned, has the 40 megapixel sensor, IBIS, all that kind of stuff. But what it has as, I guess, an advantage, but also a disadvantage, is it has a fixed 23 millimeter f2 lens. So you guys know that. The X100 series has been out for a long time, and every year it has a 23 f2 lens. With the V and the VI, it has the Series 2, and this VI lens is very, very sharp, even at f2, whereas the previous versions maybe were a little bit softer. Now, in that lens itself, it has older autofocusing motors. And so they kind of remind me of like the 27-28 or the 23-28 that just came out that partners with this. It's kind of those older autofocusing motors. It's not the same you might find in like a 33-1.4 or the newer newer lenses that have the linear motors. They're a lot smoother, quicker, and faster to respond. But nonetheless, autofocus in terms of accuracy and stuff like that is good, and this lens is very, very sharp. Now, the disappointment or the disadvantage to this type of setup is that it's the only lens you can put on here. Unless you use the converters. They have a WCL and a TCL. Now, the WCL makes it a 28 millimeter equivalent, and the TCL makes it more like a 50 millimeter equivalent. So essentially, in terms of lenses, you could have a 28, a 35, or a 50 millimeter equivalent lens. Now, of course, there's also cropping and all that kind of stuff because there's a 40 megapixel sensor, but in terms of lenses itself, that's kind of what you get. But the downturn is those converters make the camera much bigger and much bulkier. And so are you shooting a 35 all the time? If so, if you like that a lot and you're okay with maybe using a bigger, bulkier adapter, that is something to consider. On the flip side, I guess as an advantage to the X-E5, you are able to change lenses. This is an interchangeable lens mount. And so if you want to use the Fuji crons, in this case, this is the 16-2.8, but they also have a 23 f2, a 35 f2, and the 50 f2. Those lenses are very, very small and give a similar footprint to what you have on the X100VI. And so you have the advantage of going wider or more telephoto without having to use a crop or these WCL, TCL converters and keeping a similar footprint. Also, if you wanted to go much bigger and you want to do something more professional, you can put on the 50 to 140, which is a lens I just borrowed and shot with this. You can put on the 1.4 lenses. You can put on macro lenses. There's a lot more versatility in terms of the lens mount on the X-E5. Again, this is kind of low-hanging fruit, but it's something to consider, because where this has an advantage is that you can say, hey, you know what? It's a small footprint. I don't have to make decisions. It takes away that from you, forces you to be creative. Go shoot the 35 millimeter equivalent. But you could just as easily do the same thing here. Bolt the 23 f2 onto it, or the 23-2.8, the new pancake lens, or the 27-2.8, and you have a very similar footprint, and you don't have to think about it, but you have the versatility if you want it. And so for me, I like having not to make decisions because this is already made for you, but this is a win for the X-E5 in that respect. So in terms of like lens overall, I'm going to give it to the X-E5. Now, the other thing that's a bit different between these two cameras is the X100VI viewfinder versus the X-E5 viewfinder. I don't have the exact specs in front of me, but I do know that the X100VI viewfinder is better. I think it's higher resolution, 3.69 million dots versus 2.36. And I think the magnification is bigger as well. Additionally, this viewfinder has an OVF, whereas this one's just an EVF. So this viewfinder is an OVF and EVF. And you can kind of use the OVF to have that more of a older DSLR or older SLR type of experience where you're looking through glass and not being impacted by the actual screen that's in there. So if you don't like looking through a TV screen, that's something to consider. However, in practicality, what I found is that the X100VI OVF, I don't use as much as I thought I would, largely because of the parallax and how it does the parallax correction. Maybe I'm using it wrong. I don't like it as much. And so most of the time I'm using the EVF anyways to make sure my exposure is correct, and also because I know where the autofocus point is, regardless of the parallax that needs to be corrected in the OVF itself. With that said though, if you were to like look through two viewfinders and which one's better, if you consider just the EVF, the X100VI viewfinder is better. And from that perspective, I think the X100VI is an overall winner in terms of its viewfinder. But it's close if you're using the EVF only. It's close. So I give the X100VI that win. Another big difference between these two is if you notice on the top of this X100VI there's a flash, and on the X-E5 there's not. Simply put, this has the flash built in and it's an advantage. It wins over the X-E5. And if you wanted to do something similar with the X-E5, you got to bolt on either this EFX8 flash right here, which is another clip-on piece and makes it a little bit bigger in terms of its footprint. Or in a prior video, I talked about some third-party accessories like the Godox IT20, which could also go on top. So if you want to just grab and go, the X100VI wins from that perspective. However, you can just as easily put that flash on top and have a footprint that's just a tad bit bigger than the X100VI. And so the win goes the X100VI, but I think the X-E5 is pretty close. All right, the next piece is something that I don't use often, but I did just use recently to shoot this photo right here. And inside of this camera is a 3-stop, I believe it is, neutral density filter, ND filter, whereas this camera does not have that at all. This camera, if you wanted to shoot with ND filters, you would have to get either a step-up ring or the filters that go on the front of the lens that you have to adapt your ND filter to it. And then, of course, you have to pick the different strengths that you want. And so that's another piece that you have to bring with you. Whereas this, if it's within the 3 stops, this would work for you. And like I said, I did use it when I was shooting those waterfall pictures. I set the camera to f16 because I tried to cut down the light as much as possible. I was in daylight. And then I put it to a 1-second shutter speed and I used the 3-stop ND filter. And it worked really, really good. I apologize, I've been sick all week. And so from that perspective, the X100VI wins again. Another piece of equipment you have to bring. ND filters brought in, flash built in, no flash built in, no ND filters. And so you kind of have to give it to the X100VI for having that convenience for sure. One other thing on top you notice is on the X-E5, you see that there's this simulation wheel. Now, at first I thought this was stupid. I'm not a big fan of the film simulation wheels. I think it's very confusing, especially for somebody that doesn't nerd out on cameras like I do or we do. However, what the X-E5 does do that I think is an advantage over the X100VI and similar modern Fujis is that film simulation dial, if you create the custom recipes in FS1, FS2, and FS3, which you guys can probably hopefully see up here up top, it allows you to change just the film simulation recipes without changing other settings. Whereas on the X100VI, at least the way I'm using it, when I set up a custom profile, it also changes the autofocus settings and ISO settings, auto ISO settings, all that stuff. This allows me to change just the film simulation recipe portion of it while keeping my autofocus settings and auto ISO settings and that kind of stuff separate from the two, which I think is an advantage for the X-E5. Both have this little toggle in the front. I should mention that. You guys see this little toggle in the front here? They both have this toggle right here. So if you want to, click quickly for face and eye detection or whatever you use it for, it's all the same. On this one, on the Fuji X-E5, on the Fuji X100VI, you get the shutter speed dial and ISO dial built into one. Whereas on the X-E5, it is just a shutter speed dial and not an ISO dial. So you have to use the command wheels for your ISO. But there's one other big thing that's a big advantage for the X-E5, and that is the screen does this. And for most people, this won't matter. But for me, it kind of does, because I do these types of videos right here, and I like to see myself. Make sure I'm framed, make sure it's focusing, right? But I also don't lose the functionality of a tilt screen. And so the X-E5, from that perspective, the screen is much more versatile versus the X100VI, where all it does is tilt like this. I'll strap my camera. But it does not go up like the X-E5 does. And so from that perspective, for video anyways, the X-E5 is a much better setup for me. Additional to that, if you look on the side of this camera right here, come on, camera focus, there it is. This hole right there is a 2.5mm microphone jack. So you're plugging in microphones. If you want to make it work, you have to either get a dedicated 2.5mm to 3.5mm cable, or get an adapter like this is right here to convert the standard 3.5mm microphone port, or convert to 2.5mm microphone port to a 3.5mm microphone port. On the X-E5, that's not a problem. If you look right here, this is a standard 3.5mm microphone port. And so from a video perspective overall, with the flip up screen and having that better or that proper sized microphone port, the X-E5 is a clear win for me. Last but not least, comparing these two, there's something else very much I have to consider. The X-E5 is weather sealed when you put the filter on. The X100VI, I said that wrong. The X100VI is weather sealed when you put the adapter on. The X-E5 is not weather sealed. Now, the times that I actually shoot out in rain, that kind of stuff, is limited. However, I am going on a dog sledding trip in January. Long story, hopefully it snows enough to do that. And I want to record video and I want to take some photos, and I will have a camera strapped over my shoulder or my chest. And if it's snowing a ton, there's a chance that the X-E5 might be a problem because it's not weather sealed. Now, in the past when I've done stuff like this, when I go skiing, which I will go skiing again this February, I take videos and pictures of my kids. I've had Olympus cameras, and I just trash those things in the snow, and they don't even skip a beat. Like, they work flawlessly. They're perfect. And so from the dog sledding trip perspective, I really prefer the versatility of an X-E5 in terms of its lens, interchangeable lens setup. But the weather sealing might play a big factor into that decision-making process. And so at the end of the day, the problem I have is that in a lot of situations, the X100VI is the better camera. In a lot of situations, the X-E5 is the better camera. And I don't really think I need both, because what both these cameras don't do well is shoot sports. Well, this camera certainly doesn't shoot sports. This camera can if you put the right lens on it, and I've made it work in the past for sure. But I'm almost thinking that maybe it'd be better if there was a dedicated DSLR with a 70-200, or a dedicated proper sports camera with a dedicated sports type lens. For the few times I do get to shoot my son's sports, I should say it differently. Now, the other thing I need to bring up is that some of the things I brought up in this camera, the X100VI, you have to think about how often do I use them. The built-in ND filters, sometimes, rarely, not often. The flash, sometimes. Yep, that's important to me. The weather sealing, haven't used it yet, but I might be wanting to use that. But on the other hand, the flip-up screen is important for me, and the proper microphone jack is important for me, and interchangeable lenses is important for me. So the question is, do I try to make this one just work? Because it can do video as well, and just make some, I guess, adjustments. Or do I make this one work and replace this? Or do I just keep both? I don't know. And then there's the last thing to consider. This entire video was recorded on my iPhone.